So good, so good, so good.
Everything you want for summer is at Nordstrom Rack stores now and up to 60% off. Stock up and save on the brands you love like Vince, Sam Edelman, Frame, and Free People. Join the Nordy Club to unlock exclusive discounts, shop new arrivals first, and more. Plus, buy online and pick up at your favorite Rack store for free. Great brands, great prices. That's why you Rack.
Ready to soundtrack your summer? With Red Bull Summer All Day Play, you choose a playlist that fits your summer vibe the best. Are you a festival fanatic, a deep end DJ, a road dog, or a trail mixer? Just add a song to your chosen playlist and put your summer on track. Red Bull Summer All Day Play. Red Bull gives you wings. Visit redbull.com/brightsummer ahead to learn more. See you this summer.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
Welcome to the Politics Guys. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University, and I'm joined, as usual, by Ken Katkin, a professor of law at Chase Law School. Ken, welcome back this month.
It's great to be back.
It is good to be back. It's good to be doing some things. See, last week I was the third man on the show, and this week I get to take a more leading, definitive role.
They needed to bring you in because they needed someone who could talk some sense, huh?
Yeah. Well, we're going to talk about that because I'm going to bring up Makary this week a little bit because I'm curious to get your view. I was the odd man out on a few items.
Uh-huh.
Now that Mike's gone all conservative on us, or what. But so be that as it may, I wanted to start with both kind of our overseas stories. And that includes the situation in the Persian Gulf where the ceasefire is, it's starting to have almost no meaning. That's one of the things I want to talk to you about, Ken. Last week, Mike and Terry argued that I was missing the positive outcomes of the war. And this week, Trump made it clear that the ceasefire is, on his words, life support. He told reporters he didn't even bother finish reading the latest peace proposal from Tehran, calling it a non-starter. Meanwhile, Iran has now laid out a set of ultimatums. They're not even really requests. And most critically, what they've been asking for is unfettered management of the Strait of Hormuz, which, of course, we all know is not going to happen. And then just yesterday on Thursday, a ship anchored off of UAE was seized, taken towards Iran, while another was sunk. And I want to get to Trump's visit to Beijing as well, but I wanted to just kind of start with Iran since we had left on that note. What is your take at this juncture on, do we really even have a ceasefire happening, or is this just the nomenclature that we're using to bypass Congress currently?
Yeah, it's the latter. And of course, you and I talked about that even the day it was announced. I think we were on the first Saturday after the ceasefire was announced, and we both agreed there wasn't really a ceasefire. And I think there hasn't really been a ceasefire. Both sides are imposing blockades over the strait, and both sides are using force whenever anyone tries to run that blockade. So that's not what I would call a ceasefire at all. I do think it's just simply Trump tries to use that terminology both to evade Congress and also to try to keep Wall Street a little bit more calm, calm the markets and things like that.
Yeah, there's almost kind of a cyclical pattern to what he does, right? You're going to have more bellicose nature seems to come as we get ready to do the show because it's the week. It's not us, but it's coming up on the weekend. And then by the time Monday's rolling around, there's this new kind of more peaceful version of things. It's very difficult not to see that as market timed from my point of view.
Yeah, the only thing that surprises me about all that is how much the market keeps falling for it. It's like Charlie Brown in the football or something, right? Like every time Trump says, okay, now we've finally negotiated we're almost there negotiating this peace, and the ceasefire's working, and we're about to sign an agreement. Then the oil prices come down and the stock market goes up, and just exactly what he's aiming for always happens. And then like a day or two later, people realize it was just all bullshit, and then the oil prices go back up and the stocks come back down, and he just gets away with that again and again and again. But I think that's the point of the kind of rhetoric around a ceasefire. I don't think there's any reality around a ceasefire.
Well, one thing that people forget, in the short term, markets are gambling machines, and in the long term, markets are predictive machines. And it's easy to forget how true that is until you're looking at things like that and recognizing the amount of money that people bet, right? It's not really investments at that juncture. But, so last week, one of the things that we had talked about, I had come out relatively negative. Relatively is probably putting it mildly. I'd come out negatively against what was happening in Iran. And Terry and Mike argued that I was maybe suffering from a little bit of not seeing some of the positives of Iran. I think like the changes in UAE was one of the things that I brought up as being a positive. I'm just curious about your point of view. Do you think, as they did, that there's a silver lining here?
I see one silver lining here. It's that it's going to move the world much faster towards green energy, renewable energy, than if this had never happened. China's already big into that now and getting bigger. The more that the world gets afraid that the U.S., being a declining empire that still has a lot of military power, that the U.S. is unstable and unpredictable and can disrupt oil supplies, and that relying on oil is just imprudent. The more the world is going to figure out ways around that, and I think that is the greatest silver lining.
That we did not bring that up last week, and that's an excellent point. So, the other thing that was going on internationally that in some ways intersects with this, of course, was Trump's visit to Beijing, where he met with President Xi Jinping and expecting what he called a long talk and the opportunity to talk specifically about the slightly over 75-day old Iran war. But he insisted before he went in, Ken, that the United States did not need any help from China and Iran. That seems really unlikely. And this comes at the same time as the United States intelligence officials just leaked a report this week alleging that Chinese companies and Iranian officials were plotting to mask arms transfers via third-party countries. Now, at the same time, she saw a chance, I think, to change the tone of the meeting because it ends up pressing on Taiwan. As President Xi said, Taiwan's independence and cross-strait peace are irreconcilable as fire and water, end quote. And we go on to say, quote, safeguarding peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait isn't the biggest common denominator between China and the U.S. And as a reminder, the United States does not support Taiwan independence, but it also does not formally oppose it either. What did you take from Trump's? He's coming back as we're recording right now. What did you take from this visit in terms of Iran and Taiwan specifically? That's at least what I saw as being the highlights of the visit.
Yeah, Taiwan is in a lot of peril right now because I think, China, has always had a kind of a long game, a long-term strategy that they're going to retake Taiwan, but they're going to wait until circumstances are most favorable for them to do it. And the U.S. has always had such a strong resistance to that in the past that the circumstances were never favorable enough for them to actually try to do it. And I think Trump has made super clear that he's certainly prepared to deal away Taiwan, if he can get some,
well, even if he isn't willing to deal it away, one of the things I'd wondered about it seems that we're so preoccupied with other things like Iran now that it would be difficult to be a credible counterbalance, even if he was so inclined to do. I'm not disagreeing that he might not be willing to deal it away, but it seems like we might not even be able to be in a position to do that currently.
Not as sure about that, and I'm not a expert in military tactics, but my sort of general sense is, especially with these $1.5 trillion Pentagon budgets that we're looking at here, that the U.S. The ability to engage in military activities may be the one and only thing that the U.S. is not yet declining in. I think we have that in common with Russia. Like Russia is a totally degraded world power, except in terms of its ability to use force. And I think that's kind of the model that Trump is emulating here. So,
but hasn't I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt, but interesting question there. But of course, Russia hasn't been able to take Ukraine,
right?
And here we are in a conflict with Iran, and in some ways we've leveled things, but we also have not really opened up the Strait of Hormuz.
No, that of course you're right, and in fact, as we talked about last time, the U.S. has lost more wars than it's won in the period since World War II, even though we've had this overwhelming, much stronger armies than our opponents. But if I still think the big factor, if China thought that we would fight as hard as we could to protect Taiwan, and they're just simply trying to measure, how hard can we fight? Can we make trouble for them? I think they would conclude that we could still fight them hard enough that would not be the time. Like if we were really going to make that effort, then this would not be the time that they would do this. But I think what's actually shaping their thinking it's not so much about our military capacity, it's about what Trump would do. Right. And I just think Trump already showed that he doesn't care about Ukraine. He already showed that he is pretty feckless when it comes to things like the Iran war. He changes his policy like every day. And he kind of, he generally would always want to be siding with the stronger power against the weaker power because he doesn't want to take on a stronger power. And I think for all those reasons, they would probably correctly conclude that especially if they offered him something, that he wanted, which could be something as simple as, corruptly giving him money personally. That could be something that he wanted, that he isn't gonna try to stop a military invasion of Taiwan. So I think that's the way Xi would be thinking about this. I don't think he'd be thinking about it in the terms you were suggesting, if we actually got in a full-on conflict with the United States, who would win? I think he doesn't want to get in a full-on conflict with the United States, but I think he's thinking, is there a moment here where I can do this and not get in a full-on conflict?
Or
with the
any,
United
maybe,
States?
I guess, in that case, right? Have no conflict.
Have no conflict, right? That's
Yeah,
what I'm saying. Yeah. I think that's the angle here.
And I mean, there's an interesting question, and I'm glad that you got to it, because I think that's the meat of the question, which is, do we think that is his comments at this moment indicative that that's going to happen in the next 3 years? What do you think?
Yeah, I think yes, because just as indicative as his comments, I think one thing he was doing is after they have these high level meetings, there's always what they call these readouts where the both sides kind of summarize, what was discussed at the meeting. And in Xi's readout, he had all his stuff about Taiwan. And in Trump's readout, there's not one word about that. Right. And I think that that's part of what he's testing. Right. Is Trump
Is there going to be a response?
Yeah.
Even a verbal response.
A verbal response. I mean, every American president before, if there'd ever been a discussion about Taiwan, every American president of both parties would always have had in their readout, Taiwan was discussed, and we, told the Chinese, we're committed to the security of Taiwan, and this time you don't see anything like that. So I think that's part of it. I think I don't think it's a completely done deal that there's going to be an invasion in the next few years. But what I do think is it's very much on Xi's mind to keep trying to get more data about what Trump would do in response, and also at the same time to keep trying to influence what Trump would do in response, so that if he concludes that he's got an opening where at this particular moment it seems like Trump's not really going to respond for whatever reason, then bang, that's when the invasion's going to happen.
Well, and at the same time, as I had noted a minute ago, it seems likely that China is supporting Iran. And I'm not saying that woohoo, the United States is doing things perfectly, but Iran is not exactly a great actor on the world stage, one way or the other. Do you think that plays into this? I mean, again, the United States and China have such this love-hate relationship. China absolutely desperately needs the United States. And in many ways, the United States desperately needs China when it comes to we both economically. But there still is huge political differences. There are huge militarily strategic differences. It's as you're talking about there pushing on Taiwan, I can't disagree with you. But at the same time, it would be, here you are behind, supporting Iran is a relatively hostile act at this juncture.
Well, I think that's part of the actually the Taiwan strategy, because, and it's actually, in this case, both China and Russia. I think both China and Russia are supporting Iran in this conflict.
And Russia makes more sense in some ways, right? I mean, it would like to be economically independent of the United States, just hard stop. China can't do that, though.
Right. But I think what I would say part of China's objective here, besides the fact that they want to still, they are still getting oil from Iran because they can get it overland. It doesn't all need to be shipped. But but also figuring out whether Trump is going to call them out on that or not is a way of testing his resolve, right? Because certainly the Pentagon knows, that China is supporting Iran. The Pentagon knows that Russia is supporting Iran.
Which is why this got leaked. Let's be honest. You're leaking it now during this meeting. That's not an accident, right? That's on purpose.
It's on purpose, right? But if Trump, who's definitely must have been informed of all this by the Pentagon, is choosing to kind of not make an issue of it, not get confrontational about it, then he's telegraphing the kind of weakness that China's looking to see whether, what he's going to do about this kind of thing, right? So I think that China has several reasons why they would want to do this, but Taiwan's not the only one. But I think Taiwan is one of the reasons, right? It's one of the ways to test out, if we punch the U.S. in the nose, how's the U.S. going to respond? And seeing them not respond, is like emboldening more punches in the nose.
Isn't it also strange in a way? Maybe not even in a way. Let me take that back. It's just strange in the era of we're going to bring the warrior ethos back and we're going to be military first. Isn't it strange that we're having this kind of conversation right now about the way that we're confronting individuals and countries who are going? We can internally disagree about the maneuver in Iran, but to not have those kinds of responses at the same time you're posturing as a warrior culture is a weird juxtaposition between the reality of what occurs, the empiricness of what's occurring, and this kind of fake language that we're using that, this is what we're doing, which is, we're bringing masculinity back. We're bringing warriorism back. But are you in a real meaningful way?
No, that's pure theater because it's only directed against countries that we assume are much weaker, right?
Internally, it's almost like an internal purge more than it's really an external thing, right? I can't picture Pete Hegseth actually, directing some grand military strategy against China, but we certainly have ideas of him, trying to purge his own military of whatever his perceived weakness is that week.
Yeah. Well, and he wants to, market himself as this warrior guy. And then he wants to pick fights with countries like Venezuela or Greenland or Canada, that can't, of course, we're much militarily stronger than these tiny countries. Right. But, even Iran, I think, they thought, well, we are much more military. We're much stronger than them militarily. It turned out they have the ability to make a few problems for us that we can't resolve. But I think that was a miscalculation there. And I think this whole warrior ethos thing is going to always be 100% directed. We're going to be this big bully who's going to beat up on the littlest person that can't fight back. And it's never going to be directed at like countries that might actually have the capability to fight back, which would certainly include China.
Yeah. Well, and again, and that is not going away. So we'll pause on that for a minute. We'll turn internally, Ken. The Supreme Court issued a major shadow docket discussion this past Monday, ruling that Alabama can use a congressional map that a lower court found was intentionally drawn to dilute black voter influence. Now, the conflict springs from a 2023 case, Allen v. Milligan, where the Supreme Court found that Alabama had to draw a second majority black congressional district, or, in its words, something close to it. Now, late last year, the Alabama legislature passed a new map that effectively dismantled that second majority black district created after Milligan. Now, the U.S. District Court found this April that new map had, quote, flagrantly disregarded, end quote, the Supreme Court mandate, and that the map was drawn, again, with the clear intent to dilute black voters. Now, the Supreme Court overruled that, and it's likely using the Purcell principle, and that's the idea that courts shouldn't change maps too close to an election. But critics, of course, have been arguing that's just a way to keep an unconstitutional map viable for an election to stand, and potentially is yet another retreat from the Voting Rights Act Section 2 protections. Now, additionally, Ken, last week, right before we were going to the show, Tennessee we had postponed a conversation about Tennessee. Tennessee Republicans last week passed a map that cracks Shelby County, that's the county that contains Memphis, into 3 districts. And again, they're targeting the state's lone remaining Democratic seat. And it looks likely that Tennessee is now going to move to an all-Republican 9-0 delegation, with only 2 districts now leaning Republican, while all the rest are solidly Republican. So it's a little bit easier to do that in Tennessee, of course, than it was. We talked about Florida last week, where you got 1.5 million registered Republicans to only 80,000 Democrats. But there's far more independent voters in Tennessee than Florida. But we have these kind of 2 things. I mean, they weren't back to back, but obviously we punted a little bit on Tennessee, and we have another shadow docket. So maybe start with the shadow docket for us, Ken. I think I can read your mind on this one and suggest this is a court using a corrupt principle to allow a corrupt map to pass, even short term, to try to have a short term viability on the midterm elections. But maybe I'll be surprised. So
no, you won't be surprised. I mean, this is the Supreme Court at its absolute most corrupt. And I do talk about how we have a corrupt Supreme Court. And we do have a corrupt Supreme Court, but, sometimes I'll say, well, this is one where they surprised me, or this is one where, it's at least a close enough argument that even though I would have gone the other way, that their argument has some respectability. But these redistricting cases are raw political corruption and shouldn't be seen any other way. And I'm actually pleased that, I think from what I can see, there's been a discourse amongst Democrats about how appropriate or how desirable would it be to try to actively pursue Supreme Court reform if the Democrats get power again. And I think this broke the logjam on that. Like, I actually think all Democrats, or substantially all Democrats, including ones who really believed in judicial independence and separation of powers and didn't want to mess around with the court, I think they're coming to a consensus. And I think Democrats in Congress, and if we get a Democrat in the White House, it's now a sure thing that some kind of court reform is going to be coming. When
you say a court reform, be more specific there, because I might disagree to it. I'm just curious. I want to know more specifically before I do.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of proposals. Probably the best known ones are the court packing plans, but I don't know that that's what we're going to see. I don't.
Well, that's what I was going to argue too. I was going to say I recognize. It's one of those issues where I don't disagree with you that you now have unanimity of Democrats as an issue running on court pack. But I don't think once they held it that Democrats would be willing or want to. I think there'd be political costs to increasing the size.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's why I use the word court reform instead of court packing. I think those voices are going to be out there, but I don't think that's what's going to happen. But what I think actually is more likely to happen are other kinds of court reform that would actually be similarly or even more effective. Like the exceptions clause of Article 3 allows Congress to legislate exceptions to the appellate jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. So just simply taking away their jurisdiction to decide any cases that involve voting rights or districting or voter qualifications or anything like that.
And to be
Congress
clear
can strip them. What's that?
Yeah, I want to be clear for listeners, because you were using a technical term there. What that means is Congress has the power via Article 3 of the Constitution to limit the kinds of cases that the Supreme Court can hear if it's not hearing it in its original, which is granted specifically via Article 3 to the Supreme Court. Right. I think many listeners might know, but not
right. Yeah, so that you said it exactly correctly. So so just to say there's certain categories of cases that have to be decided at the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit and cannot be appealed up from there. I think that's a kind of court reform that could easily come. I think another kind of court reform that could come would be, something like reducing the resources available to the court. So just giving them that slap in the face that way. Right now I think there's a few hundred people who work in the Supreme Court building. Half of those positions could be eliminated just as which would actually make it harder for the court to function, but which would also be a very public rebuke of the court. So I think those kind of things could happen.
I hear that, but now now we're starting to veer a little bit more into my territory.
Yeah.
Congress is very, very reluctant to check. Now, historically, empirically, the one we look at as scholars is the relationship between the president and Congress. And today, because of the focus on reelection, congresspersons love using the president and president's power as a jumping point for their own reelection, but they don't ever really want to rein it in, and they certainly don't want to rein it in when you have overlapping party power. Now, you're right. In the case of the Supreme Court, we would have a different party controlling. That's going to increase the likelihood, right? So if you've got Democrats over on the other branches. However, I still think it might be harder than you're anticipating for Democrats to overcome that, because it is useful to have a president of the opposite party or a court of the opposite party and have things to run on.
Well, that was the theory about why Republicans before Trump never actually appointed justices who would overrule Roe versus Wade. I think that's your theory there on that. But I don't think it's the case anymore, because I think the thing that is different than the past, and I certainly agree with your assessment of what the past looks like. But I do think these kind of cases are really changing something, right? That when you get, especially for Democratic voters, there's always been some Democratic voters like me for whom the Supreme Court is a very important issue, but there's been a lot of Democratic voters who haven't seen that as the most important issue, and I think these recently highly corrupt cases have really changed that, so that now for just rank and file Democratic voters, Supreme Court reform for the first time and different from past history, is something that they really want to see action on. So I think there's going to be more pressure there. And also, in terms of the other thing that you said about presidential power, usually because of the nature of elections, you're often going to have, if a president gets elected, they're going to get a majority probably in at least one of the two houses of Congress. It's not that common. It has happened, but it's not that common for, a president to come in and already have both houses of Congress against them, whereas, the Supreme Court is going to be under Republican control more or less permanently. And so a Democratic Congress has to think about that this isn't something like the White House or the Congress that can go back and forth. This is something that the Republicans have captured more or less for all time, because, justices don't have to retire. They can retire when there's a Republican president. And so that as long as there's going to be more Republican presidents, if there's never another Republican president because of Trump, then eventually the Dems will get the Supreme Court. But if we see the typical pattern where, at least once every 3 elections or so, the White House switches hands, then the Republicans would never lose the Supreme Court. So the Democratic Congress has to think about it that way, that this is a corrupt partisan institution that's permanently embedded in the government, that's going to permanently try to, disrupt the government if it's in the hands of Democrats. And I think that's the way people are rightly seeing it now. So there's
that's a compelling case, and I don't disagree with pieces of that. I think the other bit of electoral politics you might be missing is the grievance is now. And so while that might very well help in the midterms, that means that really the first chance that Democrats would have, even assuming that that's something that they would keep on their plate, would be 2+ years from now. Will that still be the thing that people are thinking about or wanting 2+ years from now? Again, as a scholar of media and communication, I can say that the what we call the top of the mind issues for voters and for congresspersons, because those two things are in fact linked in interesting empirical ways. It is fickle, so fickle that it is difficult to say that's going to be something that's still there. So I hear what you're saying. In other words, if the upcoming election wasn't a midterm but a presidential election, I might have more strength being able to say, yeah, I think I agree with you. But I'm not sure I can quite agree with your analysis, given that we're going to have this lag.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
At first, I didn't think it was real. I woke up to this blinding light, and I was transported to another place. Pluto TV. Then I heard a voice.
Come with me if you want to live.
There were thousands of movies and shows, and they were all free.
The truth is out.
It's just so beautiful.
On Pluto TV, free streaming of Terminator 2, Fringe, Arrow, The 100, and The X-Files may cause excitement, loss of sleep, and sudden belief in extraterrestrials. No credit cards or alien encounters necessary. Pluto TV. Stream now, pay never.
Hi, Diva. It's Rachel.
And Jordan. Yeah, hi. Quick question.
Why are you not spending your Venmo balance?
Yeah, we're concerned.
You can, buy stuff with it.
Ugh, you love buying stuff.
And earn cash back on eligible purchases.
You love purchasing eligible things.
So the money your friend sent you yesterday, that's today's ramen or rideshare or eye patches.
The skincare kind, not the pyro kind.
Spend with Venmo, and you can earn cash back with Venmo Stash. Venmo Stash bundle terms and exclusions apply. Max $100 cash back per month. See terms at venmo.me/stash terms. ID verification required to use a Venmo balance.
Yeah, you could be right. So this is one I'm less sure about, but I'll offer a different way of thinking about it. But your way might be right. Yeah. So I think that I think the thing that Trump is doing is it's making the Democrats much more combative than prior Republican administrations did, right? That what the Trumpers call Trump derangement syndrome. I think it's real, right? That there's this kind of visceral sense that Trump is destroying American democracy, that everything he did needs to be undone, and that all the tools and methods that made it possible for him to do that need to be undone. So I think that while on the one hand, the part of what you said that I completely agree with is we can't predict what are going to be seen as the most important issues a few years from now. But what I think or what I hope will happen, and I don't know, is that I hope that the kinds of Democrats that could get elected are going to be the ones who are going to fight every fight, do as much as they can on every front, so that even if this isn't, the most important issue, they're going to do the most important issues, and they're also going to do this issue. And I think that, a lot of that does relate to eliminating the filibuster rule. None of this is going to get done unless they eliminate the filibuster rule. But I think there's more and more appetite for that. Even when the Dems last had a thin majority, Sinema and Manchin wouldn't eliminate the filibuster, and there may have been a few more Dems who also wouldn't have voted to eliminate it, but they weren't out there publicly saying that. But I think, right now, I don't think there's going to be any Democratic senators who will publicly say that they want to keep the filibuster. And so I think that changes the dynamic.
And that is true. And that'll be weird because, Republicans and Democrats have historically been pretty united in wanting to keep that. Democrats have been more willing to talk about it. Absolutely. And you're right. I think there were a few more who just didn't want to have to take the front line seats to saying, "Hey, agreed. I don't want to." Yeah,
absolutely agreed.
But you're not wrong because President Trump has been consistently calling for the end of the filibuster. Look, hey, Democrats are going to do it. Let's do it first. Let's shoot first. And that undoubtedly will sway people. And I keep thinking about that one. You're probably right that they could pass that. But I still only say probably because if Republicans don't end up doing it, I'm not sure if Republicans don't end up doing it, I'm not sure Democrats would necessarily, but it would hamstring their, I don't know. That's a good.
Yeah. I think they would do it if they had the House and the White House. I think they probably wouldn't do it if it wouldn't actually make it possible for them to pass legislation. But if the Dems had the House, the Senate, and the White House, so that the only thing that was stopping them from passing legislation was the filibuster rule, then I think they'll get rid of it because, even though I think you and I probably are both agreed that when Sinema and Manchin were out there saying, I'm not going to change the filibuster rule, there were probably 5 more Democrats who were on their side and didn't want to change the filibuster rule and were really, happy that these two were willing to take that stance, right? But I think the dynamic really does change if no one's publicly taking that stance because, if the Dems have 51 votes and 2 of those votes are saying we're not going to change the filibuster, then nobody's going to bring it up for a vote because they're going to lose. You got 2 no votes, you've already lost, right? But if nobody's out there publicly saying that, then the leadership is going to bring it up for a vote because the large majority of Democrats are going to want to eliminate the filibuster. And that's going to put more pressure, even on the handful that probably would like to keep the filibuster to not be the spoilers. They don't want to be the Thomas Massie of the next Senate, right?
Something we'll undoubtedly be talking about soon.
Yeah.
Well, excellent points. And it is It is. I think the other thing that is changing in American politics, we have long wanted minority voices to slow down government. I mean, that's one of the whole goals. I mean, we went through the Constitution. It's everywhere. But consistently and historically, we have now been pushing back against that over time. And this would be in line with that kind of shift to say, look, it's time for the Senate to just be a majority. And now, if you want to undo these things, undo them when you win your election. You don't get to stop them just because you're a minority in one of the three chambers one of the two chambers of Congress.
Yeah, and I would add to that in the 20th century, there were norms around the use of the filibuster that I would say on balance made it a very desirable institution from my standpoint, because the norms in the 20th century were that it wasn't routinized. It wasn't used on every single bill, right? So you'd have some bills that some minorities in the Senate felt especially like they couldn't tolerate if this bill would move forward, and they could filibuster against it. But by the time you get to the 21st century, it's routinized to the point where it's expected that every bill needs to have a filibuster-proof majority in order to pass, that every minority that disagrees with a bill is going to use the filibuster to block that bill every time. And I think that, if that's the way it's going to work, it's an undesirable institution. Like it causes more harm than good.
Well, I mean, again, and I think that's because our view of majorities have changed, right? I think historically, again, we've seen this as we've been going through the Federalist Papers too, right? We just got done doing number 10 last time we were doing things together. This idea that you've got to be worried about majorities. And I think today, modern political folks say the way you deal with majorities is by forming counter majorities to take over and change things.
To slightly push back. I don't totally agree with that. I think
okay, I'm so sorry.
Yeah. No, I think a system where there's a presumption of majority rule, and there's the ability for minorities to block things that they're especially troubled by, I think that's an optimal system. And I think that's the system that we had in the 20th century when we still had norms around the judicious use of the filibuster. But I think it's the changing of those norms where I think we moved away from that best system, where the system was majority generally rules, minority will occasionally use a power that it has to block things that are especially offensive to it, is a good system. But it's I think actually been abused by the minorities, because if the minorities are going to say, well, we'll just block everything. It doesn't matter whether it's a thing that we really can't live with or just a thing that we would simply vote against. No matter what it is, we're going to block it. Then that's minority rule. That's the 100% opposite of majority rule, right? And so I think a majority rule with some protections for the minority is the optimal system. But if we have to choose between no protections, but we're either going to have majority rule or minority rule, I'd rather have majority rule than minority rule.
Okay, I hear what you're saying there. Yeah, I mean, and there's a lot of philosophic talk to have there too, which is the question of, well, that would always require the minority to differentiate and be able to differentiate between what you might call level A problems and level B, C, D kind of problems. And likewise, it requires a majority that says, okay, we're going to respect it.
Yeah, but we had that
on these, but we're not.
It requires nuance, but we actually had it for 100 years. That's the system we had for 100 years. That did not break down until the 21st century.
Well, but again, I guess I don't disagree that we didn't have it. So don't hear me disagreeing with you on that front. What I'm wondering is, would that kind of arrangement built on unofficial separating of issues, could it work today? Put aside Trump, I'm just saying, could that work the way that Congress is elected moves forward today? And that's what I'm having a pause about.
Yeah. No,
right?
I agree. I agree with you there, but that's why I think the filibuster needs to just be eliminated. Like, I think the conditions that made it a desirable thing, which I think we did have for 100 years, made it a good institution under those kinds of political conditions. But I actually agree with you. I think political conditions have changed to the point where it wouldn't work today. But that's why I'm really advocating eliminating the filibuster. So I'm saying the filibuster now is generally serving a very harmful role, sometimes serving a good and useful role, but most of the time serving a very harmful role. And so it's better to get rid of than to keep.
Well, let's continue to move forward then. The other big story I wanted to touch this week, Ken, former mayor of Arcadia, California, resigned this past week, on the 11th, after federal charges were unsealed, revealing she had been an illegal agent for the People's Republic of China. Wang has agreed to plead guilty to a felony count of acting as a foreign agent without notifying the U.S. government, which carries a maximum penalty of 10 years in prison. Experts and legal experts argue that this is a new part of the broadening attack of China at the same time as President Trump was, of course, in China, as we talked about earlier. The DOJ has alleged, and it appears to be true, given that she's admitting guilt at this juncture, that Wang was serving the interest of the Chinese government from 2020 to 2022. She and her former fiancé, Mike Sun, operated a fake website called U.S. News Center, which was purportedly to be for Chinese immigrants, but was actually designed and being used to disseminate pro-communist propaganda provided specifically by Chinese officials, including downplaying of genocide. She was directed via encrypted messaging apps, and she was in communication apparently with high-level members of the Chinese intelligence apparatus. FBI Director Kash Patel stated that the case is part of a broader effort to, quote, root out this kind of influence in American institutions, end quote. For her part, and from her attorney, Wang has said that she was mistakenly persuaded by a person she loved and trusted. But the evidence, however, suggests it was much larger than that she was acting, again, directly with Chinese officials. The allegations predate her position as mayor, as Democrats have been quick to note this week. But it is also clear that Wang was, according to the FEC, during that period, backing numerous Democrats financially in California, which leads to questions about more detailed connections. So, Ken, I mean, it is kind of ironic that, right as we were talking about the push of China, what's Trump's response going to be with Xi, that we have probably one of the biggest level cases that we've had in a while for someone acting as a foreign agent in this sense. What was your take on all of this?
Well, I don't actually agree it's such a big case. I agree that she's probably guilty of the charge, but I think it's actually one of the most minor kinds of cases that could be brought under the Foreign Agent Registration Act, because she was basically, I don't think I could be wrong about this, but the facts as I read them was that she was never involved in any kind of direct lobbying of any federal officials. So is that right? Or can you correct me on that if I was wrong?
Be honest, her side appears to be trying to draw a distinct line that suggests that all of the wrongdoing that she is admitting to only happened from 2020 to 2022, and ergo did not involve her while she was actually operating in politics, right?
Or even operating as a she wasn't operating as a lobbyist either, is what I'm saying.
Yes. Yeah. That seems to be. It is not as clear that what is in fact that is what she is alleging in her plea deal, right, or what she's hoping to be the plea deal.
So if she was actually, exercising power as a government official or doing direct lobbying of federal officials, then I would agree it's a serious case.
It just seems hard to believe. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, and maybe I'm reading into that too. But it would seem strange to me that suddenly 2022 rolls around and you go, okay, wait a second, I've won an election, so now peace. I'm not going to communicate with y'all anymore. I'm not. Yeah. I mean, it could be the case. I mean, she wasn't running the website at that juncture,
right? And I mean, that's what I say. All of the charged conduct that she's accused of in the indictment is basically related to this website, right? That she's putting out a website and she's putting out information on the website that's being fed to her by the government of China or by the Communist Party of China, perhaps. But, that is, the only violation of law there is that she didn't register as a foreign agent. Which in a case like this, I would say is a technical violation because her audience was the general public. the general public wouldn't have known whether or not she was registered as a foreign agent. So, I think if she was doing, direct lobbying of legislators, it would become a much more serious thing. Like legislators are being lobbied and they don't know that the person who's lobbying them is an agent of a foreign government. But I think like the general public, they look at websites like RT, the Russia Today website, or they look at websites like Al Jazeera, which is run by I think the Qatari government. And, they don't have, they have maybe some general kind of awareness that these are foreign news sources, but they don't know, who's registered and who hasn't registered and things like that. So, the basic conduct isn't illegal here. The only thing that's illegal is the failure to register as a foreign agent. And I think that the seriousness of that is pretty minor, considering that the audience for what she was doing wouldn't have been in a position to know whether she was registered or not. So I see this as a very minor case, not a wrongful conviction. I think she probably is guilty, but I think it's one of the most minor Foreign Agent Registration Act violation cases I've ever heard of.
Again, and that's what leads me again to suggest it seems unlikely to me that this ends as she's running the campaign, right? I mean, like, again, you say, okay, I'm going to run a campaign, and now all these people I've been chatting with, I'm not going to take anything from them. I'm not going to have any advice from them. I mean, they have the encrypted messages now, which is a technical interesting question. Like, how do you get access to the signal messages that were part of the indictment? But there they are. It makes me wonder. I can't help but imagine that this was China hoping to have an individual who was running. Now, obviously, small town or small is an understatement, but a little town in California is not exactly the federal government. But it would be very emblematic of Chinese. Let's beta pilot. Something. Here we've got somebody and now they're going to run for office. How do we help them? I would not be shocked if there's not more that comes later.
Yeah, that could be a serious concern, but that this was a beta test for a bigger kind of project. I can't dispute that, but I think if she had actually exercised her mayoral power in any way that could be traced back to, she's doing this because the Chinese government told her to do it, that would have been in the indictment, I think. I think that would be, why would they skip charging the most culpable conduct and only charge the less culpable conduct? And so I don't
Unless you were still building something or you still thought you had threads. In other words, it wasn't the end of but that's a fair point, though. Like, in general, why wouldn't you?
Why wouldn't you put it in the indictment?
Yeah.
I mean, so I just don't see evidence of that. So I'm not saying she's innocent, but I'm just saying, I imagine that we don't know what she pled to in terms of what sentence she's going to get. There's an agreement there,
right,
where, she's pled guilty, but we don't know yet what they, I wouldn't be surprised if the sentence turns out to be extremely light and probably involved no prison time at all. Because I think what the government wanted here was the conviction so that they could have this news story, but that they didn't consider the conduct that culpable either. And so they're willing to take a plea agreement for possibly no prison time served at all. And if that's what we end up seeing, then I think that will confirm my idea that this wasn't very serious conduct.
And you move forward. Yeah.
Well,
I think we need to get to one last story, or fourth story today, Ken. There was a massive shakeup at the FDA this week with the departure of Dr. Marty Makary, the man President Trump had picked to lead the agency and slash through red tape. But he lasted only 13 months. Reports suggest the breaking point wasn't a major drug trial, but actually a direct confrontation with the White House over fruit-flavored vapes. I am not teasing, friends. Fruit-flavored vapes. As the Wall Street Journal aptly put it, quote, in the end, Marty had just about run out of allies, end quote. And now, according to current sources, the administration was reportedly pressuring Makary to greenlight those fruit-flavored vaping products to appease industry lobbyists, a move Makary felt was a compromise of the health of American youth. Now, from the reporting, again, this is, from the reporting, Trump wanted to appease young MAGA voters. And apparently, I didn't realize this, Ken, vaping is a big part of that culture. Who knew? here we are. We can have funny comments in a minute. Dr. Makary was already under scrutiny from some pro-life activists for what they had called a slow walking a review of milpristone. Now, while the FDA would reverse and allow vapes, it appears that Makary resigned this week, according to the Wall Street Journal, so that he wouldn't have to defend that decision in an upcoming Senate hearing that was scheduled. He is a Johns Hopkins surgeon with traditional medical credentials, and that had been one of the reasons why, Maha liked him, because he had said some pro-Maha things, but he didn't seem like a dangerous pick because, again, this is a Johns Hopkins guy. And as a result, he was kind of a compromise pick, but apparently it was too much of a compromise. And those two activities put him in deep conflict, specifically with President Trump. It also, according to reports, put him in conflict with Kennedy as well. And right now, the number 2 is acting head of the FDA. So, Ken, what do you think about the great grape vape resignation?
Well, the last thing you said, I wonder about, that this also put him in conflict with Robert F. Kennedy. I've heard that also, but I'm wondering if that's a little bit of misdirection. And I wonder if it's that he was actually very aligned with Robert F. Kennedy, and that Trump, in some ways, is in some conflict sometimes with Robert F. Kennedy, but Trump maybe doesn't think he can fire Robert F. Kennedy because, maybe 5% of the Trump vote that came in probably wouldn't have come in for Trump, but for the fact that it was like the moms who were voting to get Robert F. Kennedy in there. And, he might think Robert F. Kennedy brings him a certain percentage of voters that he can't afford to alienate, so he can't fire him. But firing Makary is like a proxy for firing Robert F. Kennedy, because I actually don't know what issues they didn't see eye to eye with each other on, but yet I do keep hearing that there's these conflicts. But what issue is that?
The one possibility, and I mean, we're getting into the weeds of weirdness here, friends, but I do honestly think it explains potentially some of this. There is an emerging subset of Maha that thinks that tobacco is, in fact, a pretty big cure and a fix for health problems. And that's not a joke. So I'm not teasing. I'm not taking a shot at anybody. As a matter of fact, one of my neighbors who just moved away recently, we chat, and he's pretty good because he kind of lives in that space, or he did live in that space a little bit. And he was telling me, listen, you got to read this book, which I have now looked up. I won't share it because it's trash and nobody should be sharing it. But the takeaway was tobacco and real meat will actually fix a lot of your issues, right? And my guess is that I can imagine, jeans wearing, let's go out and get in the thing, Kennedy could actually have been saying, listen, let's do the things that the industry wants on these vapes, because this will be a good thing. We're going to put non-harmful, because not cigarettes, right? It's got to be vaping. That's the non-harmful version of tobacco in people's hands. And it's hard for me to believe that anybody from Johns Hopkins would have been able to pick up that book and go, oh, I'm convinced tobacco is actually a really good health benefit for people. So I hear what you're saying, and I can't disagree with you. That is a possibility, and I have but I could also imagine a universe where one of the issues here was, I don't think Trump gives a crap. I think it was just industry thing on Trump's part, but I can imagine Kennedy going, aha, it's another thing they don't want you to know about, the power of tobacco.
Could be, but as you pointed out, the pressure on Makary actually started even before this, the issue about vapes, flavored vapes, and
that's fair.
So that may have been the straw that broke the camel's back. Maybe he did see differently than RFK Jr. on that, but on things like vaccines and mifepristone, which have been controversial for Trump, I think most Americans do believe in vaccines. Some certain part of Trump's coalition, is anti-vax.
Careful, friend. I was looking at the most recent stats, and you would be surprised who and how large, vaccine skepticism is now. So much so, as a matter of fact, today, that many infants are not getting even their vitamin shots, which has led to all kinds of infant mortality. They're not even really a vaccine, but because they're coming in a shot form, parents are asking them to not be given to their kids. And it's not weirdly just, it's easy to say, oh, that's just MAGA. But when you look at the data, that's one of the more cross-cutting issues, ironically.
Well, I don't know. I mean, you could have both an issue that, is affecting tens of millions or hundreds of millions of people, and still that could still be a minority position, right? I've got to think that, when
Okay,
yeah,
continue.
yeah,
Yeah.
when Trump did things like, when RFK did things like stop recommending the COVID vaccine, that was pretty popular among his base and Trump's base. But I think there was a lot of panic and fear out there in the country from the majority who actually wanted to keep getting COVID vaccines, that this is going to make it harder for to make sure their insurance companies will pay for it and things like that. So I generally think the RFK stance on vaccines, and which I think it's not the most popular stance. But maybe we don't. I don't know. Maybe you're right about that. On mifepristone, similarly, I think RFK and apparently Makary, they don't really have a problem with mifepristone. This is something where there's people in the Trump coalition who are much more anti-abortion, who are wanting to, bang the drum on that issue and see some action. But I think both of those two were probably aligned with each other, both RFK and Makary, that they didn't really want to rescind the approvals of mifepristone. They didn't even want to start the studies that people were asking them to start to reevaluate the safety and efficacy of that drug. So I think some of these decisions, which are maybe controversial within Trump's base, I see the rift as being basically between, parts of Trump's base and what was actually being done at HHS, more than I see it as being between RFK Jr. and Makary. But that, in order for Trump to kind of appease the parts of his base that are, demanding more action in certain direction, more action to reduce access to vaccines, more action to reduce access to mifepristone, things like that, that in order to appease, parts of the base that aren't seeing as much action as they want on that, somebody's head had to roll. And I think it was easier for him to roll Makary's head than RFK's head.
I was just curious because I'm always the data guy on these kinds of things. So I grabbed the kind of the summary level public opinion data on it. And I was curious, childhood vaccines, but, when you do the overall, only 79% of the U.S. population consider them highly supportive of those. COVID-19 boosters, when you take a look across, a little under 30% have support or trust in that. CDC recommendations are now slightly under 40% confidence on those fronts. So, you're not wrong. It's still a majority of Americans for most things but those are pretty big minorities anymore. And although there are differences, I was quickly grabbing this data, so I don't have all the differences by party, but there you go. There's a little bit of data for you.
Yeah. Well, I think what you just told me, if I can interpret it, just the things that you just said, the way I would look at that is to say, you've got significant parts of Trump's base who hold views where they want to reduce access to vaccines. They want to reduce access to mifepristone, although I know you were only talking about vaccines, but I think it's similar, and so they want to see more action. But, that action hasn't happened. But yet Trump also doesn't really want that action to happen because he doesn't want to alienate even more voters by going against, certainly on most vaccines, as you just cited, that would be going against majoritarian opinion. I think you said 79% maybe. So I think he's kind of happy to have the MAHA rhetoric and not the MAHA action, for reasons you were talking about earlier about the U.S. Supreme Court. Sometimes the political sweet spot is to take a rhetorical position, say that you're fighting for it. That appeals to the people who want you to fight for it, but you don't actually want to achieve it because then that's going to alienate the much larger percentage of people who are against it. And I kind of think that's the game that Trump has been trying to play on some of these issues. And so I think in order to play that game, sometimes heads have to roll. And that's again kind of how I'm interpreting the Makary.
And the head rolled this week.
Yeah.
Well, Ken, I think on that, French head rolling note, we should probably bring the show to an end. But we're not done. done. Just because the show's over doesn't mean we're finished. I know that seems weird. That's because we've got supporters exclusive shows. And Ken and I, we have been going through the Federalist Papers. That's right, the Federalist Papers. We're going to be taking on 11, 12, and 13 this week if you'd like to join us for that ride. And it's easy to do. You just got to be a supporter of the Politics Guys. And you don't just get myself and Ken, although that's amazing. You also get access to our Substack on the for even more detail on the Federalist Papers. And additionally, you get access to things like the Ideology Show that I'm doing with Justin and so much more. So if you're not already a supporter, give yourself 5 minutes and head to politicsguys.com/support or head to patreon.com/politicsguys and take a look at the different levels of support. And don't forget, you get a free trial. So maybe you want to take a listen to that show. Again, head over there. You're going to have some free trials. There's also different kinds of discounts you can get for depending on how you support the show. So maybe you want to support us at a yearly rate at a lower cost. You can find all that again at politicsguys.com/support or patreon.com/politicsguys. Or if you are younger, just go ahead and click on the show notes. They're right there. Now, if you're not in the financial position to support the show, but you'd still like to get access to some of those shows, reach out to us at mail@politicsguys.com so that we can get things set up. Please subscribe, rate, and review. That's always big for episodes, for shows of our sides. As always, I'm going to finish by our shout out to just the incredible executive producers of our show. And they are Wilmer Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, Brian Matza, Jody Marie Miller, and Sean Fugit. We'll be back with a full episode next week. I hope you'll join us then.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.
Did you know if your windows are bare, indoor temperatures can go up 20 degrees? Get ahead of summer with custom window treatments like solar roller shades from Blinds.com and save up to 45% off during the Memorial Day Early Access Sale. Whether you want to DIY it or have a pro handle everything, we've got you. Free samples, real design experts, and zero pressure. Just help when you need it. Shop up to 45% off site-wide right now during the Early Access Memorial Day Sale at Blinds.com. Rules and restrictions apply.